Monk's raid buff, Mystic Touch, has been buffed to give 8% physical damage instead of 5%. This is a pretty big topic, a lot of people who play physical classes are celebrating, but beneath the surface first impressions, the impacts of this will be negative, mostly because of the way that Blizzard does tuning. First, let's dissect their reasoning behind this buff. They acknowledge that there is more magic damage in a raid comp than physical, and that is true. These changes do bring Mystic Touch to be equal or stronger to Chaos Brand, as shown in my prog kill of Sprocketmonger, or this random world 1700 guild I found without a monk. Both debuffs in these scenarios would provide about 2% damage post-buff. And that sounds great in a vacuum, the debuffs are equal in terms of raid gain, but what's the point? A physical class is now absolutely dependent on monk. There is a massive disparity in the strength of the debuffs being 3% and 8%, which is not elegant, and it's not really solving any problem. I looked at the logs of every Galliwix kill in the last few weeks, about 2,000 total. There are 59 kills of Galliwix without a monk present. So is this the problem? That 2% of guilds are electing to prog Galliwix without a monk? No, it's not the problem, because there are almost just as many kills without a DH. 35 kills of Galliwix have been done with no DH debuff, and then 34 kills have been done without a warrior buff in the raid. And if class representation on a boss was such an issue, you do not want to look at some of the other classes. These are all the kills on Galliwix without a rogue. You might say that this is skewed because Monk was popular this tier, but even if we look at Nerubar Palace, where all 3 Monk specs were quite mid and only really brought as a debuff, the amount of Anseret kills with a Monk missing is still very similar to the amount of kills with a DH missing. So we can see the reason that people are not bringing a Monk to a boss is not because their debuff is not equal to Chaos Brand, and thus I would argue that buffing Mystic Touch like this merely makes the raid less accessible to guilds who do not readily have a Monk player available, potentially because of roster issues or absences. This change is worse for low-end guilds because, let's be real, any guild that has no monks in the raid is not running no monks on purpose. If we look at this on the other end and think that this change was made to prevent degenerate caster-only comps from Race the World First being made, that is just not real. No boss has been killed in Race the World First without a monk since Mystic Touch got introduced. So if we assume that this change was not made to benefit raid, what was it made to benefit? Could it be Mythic Plus? Theoretically, this change is a 3% buff to pure physical classes. Outlaw Rogue, BM Hunter, Feral Druid, Fury and Arms Warrior, Windwalker. We've seen the rise of a physical-based comp this season, almost doing the same keys as rank 1 Magic comp, and Magic comps have been ruling M+ for several years now. So is this a good change to bring back physical classes in keys? No. So we have to look at the way that Blizzard does balancing. When Blizzard puts out a tuning patch, they tune against the baseline. If classes are underperforming compared to this baseline, they usually get an aura buff, maybe a 3% or 5% increase in all damage. If classes are overperforming at the start, they usually get an aura nerf, and sometimes individual abilities will get changed. This baseline is usually raid performance. They don't necessarily use Warcraft log statistics, but the patterns they do tuning in is very similar to the presentation of these statistics almost every time. And in raid, everyone is assumed to have every single raid buff because majority of guilds are using every damage-based raid buff, which is also obviously Blizzard's intention. So about a month after the raid release, when Race the World First ends, they will release about 3 tuning patches, one every few weeks. So if all the physical classes are brought up 3% by Mystic Touch now, then they won't be brought up by 3% again in these patches. But underperforming casters will be brought up by 3%. So now we are just at square one as if we had 5% Mystic Touch. Except now our Mystic Touch is 8% and our physical base classes are dependent on it for Mythic Plus. If you bring an Outlaw Rogue into a comp without Mystic Touch, they are only doing 92% of normal damage. But if you bring an Arcane Mage into a comp without Chaos Brand, they are still doing 97% of normal damage. Losing 8% of your damage by not having a single niche class in your group is crazy, but it can go even deeper than that. If you were to play Feral Druid in place of Boomy in the live God comp, that is with a VDH, Disc, Mage and DK, the Feral Druid would be losing 13% damage on live. Next patch, this goes up to 16%. A Boomy in the opposite position only loses 7.5% damage playing in a suboptimal comp. And for reference, 16% is a massive number. It only took 12% worth of buffs this season to take Arcane from the worst spec in the game to being incredibly strong and in every comp. So this 8% Mystic Touch creates an ecosystem where the Mythic Plus player base is divided based on class. If you're in LFG as a magic comp, you are kind of trolling to take someone that's on a physical class without Mystic Touch, because they will be artificially handicapped. And God forbid that a physical class ends up being overpoweredly strong in a season. One tier, we are bound to have a meta where something like BM Hunter is overpowered in keys, and the meta becomes a physical meta. And that would be great for the physical classes, but we would run into the same issues we have had in the past where it is absolutely mandatory to play with Mystic Touch, just to buff your overpowered DPS. Say we end up with some crazy comp where we have like a Brewmaster in to provide this monk buff. Suddenly, the tank balance is terrible, and you can't flex to any other tank without losing an immense amount of group damage. This has happened in the past. In Dragonflight Season 3 and 4, Shadow Priest was incredibly strong, and so were VDH and Mage. Each of those classes buffed the Shadow Priest by 5%, so even if you swapped those classes out for other classes that were doing good damage, like Rat Paladin or Warlock, not only were you taking a utility hit, but you would also just lose a lot of damage from the group buff. And in response to this, they actually did nerf Chaos Brand and Int down to 3%, and this is widely regarded as a good change. DH and Mage are still being played on every boss in Raid, they are both still currently in the meta comp, and they both still just have the strongest Raid buffs but feel less mandatory to have in the group if you are trying to make a slightly off meta comp. So we took a step forward and now we are taking a step back. Ranged magic classes can pretty much play in whatever comp they want, while physical melee are forced to only play in a very specific buff-filled comp. Pretty bad for pugging or playing with your friends. And because we are in PTR, they are definitely doing a lot of balance patches soon. MM and BM Hunter are currently overperforming in raid and dungeon testing, so those specs are already looking to get nerfed with respect to the 8%. There might not even be a brief period where a physical comp is on top, even with this 8%. And you have to admit the timing of this is hilarious. We just came out of a tier where 5 monks were played on a boss in World First Prog, and there is endless drama from the DK community about a raid buff, and then they go and bring one of the existing raid buffs up. Although I will say on this front, I definitely think adding more raid buffs will not help the game for a lot of the reasons I gave before in this video. So the question is, if buffing Mystic Touch is not relevant for the participation of monks in raid, and if buffing Mystic Touch does not help physical classes in Mythic Plus, then what are we buffing Mystic Touch for?